All right. So tonight's message, I had a couple stories to go through, and they're kind of they're kind of obscure ones, and people don't really tell them a whole lot in church, especially the first one. So tonight's message is about sabotage, and specifically that there are a lot of different facets to that. And we'll go over a few different kind of things because it's more general than about one specific thing. And to kind of give you guys a picture of it, we'll go through it. So the first story is from the book of Judges. Specifically, it's Judges 11, and it's the story of Jephthah. Now, I'm going to kind of skip through it a little bit, but Jephthah became the 9th judge of Israel. Effectively, he was a warrior, a mighty one in particular, but it talks about how his father's name was Gilead, his mom was a prostitute. So, but to skip a little bit ahead to get to the point of the story.
It's very obscure so far. It's very obscure so far.
The thing with Jephthah was that he was called to be a judge, and he proceeded to go through Israel and remove some of the peoples that had been there. The first group that he opposed was called the Amorites. There was also the Ammonites, who he was supposed to take down as well. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and go to verse 7. This was after Jephthah responding to the commanders of Israel coming and making him the leader. Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead." Jephthah answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" The elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, "What do you have against us that you have attacked our country?" The king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers, "When Israel came out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peaceably." Jephthah sent messengers back to the Ammonite king, saying, "This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. But when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the desert to the Red Sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Give us permission to go through your country.' But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed in Kadesh. Next they traveled through the desert, skirted the lands of Edom, and Moab passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab, camped on the other side, and he goes on to explain this. The point is they have this back and forth, and ultimately it comes down to the point that they're going to go to war. Now, in battle, what it comes down to is this point of letting the Lord be the judge to decide the dispute. And the thing of it is that God was very much so on the side of Israel, and this was established and known all too well. Even the point behind these people going out to Jephthah was the knowledge that God was going to give the Ammonites over to them. Yet, Jephthah does a thing, and this is the part of the story that most people don't talk about. His tragic vow started in verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came over Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah to Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Now he made this vow, but victory was already in his hands. When Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands, he devastated 20 towns. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his house in his home in Mizpah, who should come to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "O my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I have made an oath to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends because I will never marry." "You may go," he said. He let her go for 2 months. She and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he vowed, and she was a virgin. So, to kind of summarize, he's called forward to go and fight these people on account of Israel. On the eve of battle, even though he's got God with him, he makes a vow, an unnecessary vow. And even beyond that, when you get down into the scriptures, there are 2 things that we're looking at. He makes a vow that he's going to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house. Ends up being his daughter, whom he then does sacrifice. Now there are some scholars who claim that his sacrifice of her was that he gave her to the temple in some regard, and she became a virgin for the Lord. And it's basically they justify it on the point that it ends with, "and she was a virgin." But his vow was that he would give her up as a burnt offering. And it also says he did as he vowed. So he sacrificed his daughter to keep a vow to God that he made without needing to. And the thing of it was that he already had the victory. This was not needed. And then when you look in the scriptures and find out what God actually says about 1 vows and 2 child sacrifice, it's not favorable. It's Jesus specifically who talks about not making promises, not swearing by anything, but rather letting your no be no and your yes be yes. So that's Jesus' standpoint, which is also God's standpoint on vows. The other point is on child sacrifice, which it's in Jeremiah, where God explicitly says of that subject, "I never even entered into my mind to ask you to do such a thing," speaking to Israel. On top of that, so much of the Old Testament involves stories of God sending out the Israelites against these people who are doing this thing because it's abominable. So we have this biblical hero, in a sense, who has done 2 very bad things and claimed it for the Lord. The thing about Jephthah and his story is that it's a fine example of what so many of us do, especially when it pertains to God. We try to bargain with him. We try to get him to do things that we want him to do, and in the process of that, we oftentimes we end up sabotaging ourselves over and over and over again. Jephthah never needed to make any kind of vow like that, and he didn't need to fulfill it. He could have talked to God about it, but instead he blindly pursued this course of action that was completely unnecessary and even wrong by God's own standards. And as a result, he ends up burning his daughter. And even though this is a pretty stark and brutal example of that, again, this is something that we do on a routine basis. How many times do we set ourselves up to fail long before we ever even try? How many times do we have something right in our hands, and then because we get anxious about it, we decide that we're going to assure ourselves that we're going to have this, so we try to create some kind of bizarre bargain or some kind of statute. God, if you give me this thing, then I will do this. Jephthah wasn't a man who was close to God. Like, at least not in any way that's evidenced by this story. You know, this wasn't like Moses where he was talking to God on a pretty routine basis. He was just blindly acting and doing things in accordance with laws and standards. And the reality is that a lot of us live that way. A lot of us come to God not as children meeting their father, but instead as beggars petitioning a king. We come fearful, we come ignorant, we come doubtful. There's no place where I see this more often than when we pray. Like, there's a lot to be said about prayer, and like a lot of pastors joke about prayer, and a lot of people joke about prayer and how it looks for people to pray. And I mean, you know, you could go over the litany of different kinds of prayers that you hear from people. And some of it's funny, some of it's whatever, but it doesn't matter. Like, if you're the kind of person who says just all the time in your prayers, or you say God's name over and over and over again, it honestly doesn't matter. What matters, though, is when you look at how you pray and you realize that you're subconsciously illustrating that your relationship with God is the kind where you're afraid and doubtful, and you actually believe him to be somebody that's way off out there and not somebody that's close to you. So it's one of these deals where, and in the process of that, that's where we're most likely to sabotage ourselves over and over and over again, because we're not treating this like a relationship where we're close. Instead, we're treating this as a situation where we have to earn love. We have to earn anything at all. Favor. We have to earn favor. And when we're earning favor, when we're earning love, that's when we're screwing up. Like, what will you do in order to earn those things? And what's more than that is, you know, sometimes you'll find yourself catering to systems that are in place. And that's fine. But the problem is that a lot of us don't, we're always setting ourselves up for failure here. And I use failure as a broad term. That's simply to say that we set ourselves up to end up not being anywhere closer to God when we started praying than when we ended. And it doesn't develop our relationship. It doesn't develop anything. All that it does is set us up. We'll put out this thing, God, if you'll do this thing, prove yourself, then I'll do this. God, if you do this thing, then I'll do this. Or God, I'll do this thing. I'll do all these things as long as you do this one thing for me. We just talked about like how God doesn't really do the whole transaction thing just a couple weeks ago. Like that's not his forte. So when we find ourselves doing that, it's the kind of thing where he's just like, why? All you needed to do is ask me to do this for you. You don't need to sweeten the deal or anything like that. And we do that all the time when we're desperate. You don't need to be desperate with him. We don't feel that way. We feel desperate. We feel like we really need him to come through in this way or that. But those feelings don't match reality, and they certainly don't match any of the relationship that he's fought for or even died for. And then in the worst case scenarios, you end up with stories like this, where you've got people who are doing things that are actually legitimately unholy, and they're doing it for God. Like, we'll talk about institutional sabotage in a few minutes, but we always have to stop and look at ourselves and where we're really at first. Is it our ignorance that leads us to places where we're gonna like do things for God? I remember I had one guy come up asking for prayer one time, and he was asking that God would provide a friend of his a sexual partner, shall we say, in order to ensure that that friend didn't go away somewhere to keep him in town. And I just sat there and I'm just
Salvation.
like, why do you think that God would answer that prayer with anything but a no?
Yeah.
Well,
Here's
because
hoping.
I don't want my friend to leave. Okay, that's fine. But are you actually going to ask God to prostitute somebody out so that you can keep your friend?
God is not a pimp.
Here's your Sky Daddy.
God is not a pimp. If there's one thing to take away from tonight, it's that. There's this very dark story from Judges, but remember that God is not a pimp. But it just kind of stands to illustrate the point that this is where we go in our desperation and our fear and our anxiety, all these different things that rule us. And often at times that's where we live. And we can be desperate for so many different things, but we find ourselves just screwing up. There's a passage out of James here. It's James 1. It's one of our things for tonight. James writes in James 1:5, "If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. But when he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all he does." A lot of people read this and think that you have to, what he's saying is you have to have belief in what you're saying, in the sense that you need to force yourself to believe that God's going to do this for you. No, that's not the point. The point is that God gives generously without finding fault, right? That's the thing to believe in. That's the standard. If you don't believe in that and you're going to doubt that, then yeah, you're probably not going to receive, because at the end of the day, God might provide you the wisdom, and you might just sit there and question it until it falls by the wayside. It's a thing that happens all the time. I've seen so many Christians where, even ones who hear from God very clearly on a routine basis, and they'll ask God for some knowledge or some wisdom, and he'll tell them, And they'll be like, was that really from God? No, that couldn't be from God. There's no way that could be from God. God wouldn't talk to me about this. God would never share this with me. God doesn't care about me. And then they dismiss it until somebody else shows up and is like, hey, God told me this thing about you and for you. Oh, so that was real. Oh, okay. And not everybody has that even. A lot of people just end up with just the scriptures or just the feelings and just the wonder. You know, some people are very blessed and they don't realize how blessed they are because they forget sometimes what it's like to stand there outside of that place. Because we're too busy being ruled by our desperation, our fears, our anxieties. Those are given too much ground in our lives. So much ground, in fact, that they muddy the waters of God's own character. And we're willing to lose ourselves in the process of that. Like Jephthah. Ideally, not to the extreme of sacrificing your kids.
Taking notes.
Remember these words here, they're very important.
I was concerned. I was concerned. Now I'm less concerned.
I appreciate that. I'll write that in his baby book.
Just in quotes, God is not a him.
That'll be in there too.
So,
Godfather Nathan says.
technically, that'd be Godmother Heather, so that was hers.
True.
She started it.
I'll give her credit.
Forgot
Sorry.
one person.
Plagiarism.
Uh-huh.
You need to fix that.
Yeah.
This falls right.
And that's the thing, and like, it's funny in a way because like literally there's a situation happening in life right now, outside of like group and whatnot, where like one of my family members is literally doing this to her own kids. Like she's so desperate to get married that she's like throwing her kids to the wolves effectively, and even her own lifestyle. She's pulling a Jephthah. She's just not literally burning them to death. She's just casting them out into
I
the
will
wilderness.
also not throw them.
Yeah.
Light toss is fine. Throwing him is not so cool.
Yeah. But that's the thing, is like, when we stand in places where we know God and we can trust in his character, then we can be free of this particular issue to some extent. But it's important that we remember who he is, and we remember who we are to him. I don't sit around and share these messages about identity and value all the time because they occasionally have meaning. Who God is as a person, as a character, as an individual, and who you are in relation to that matters exponentially, and it continues to matter at every single little facet of existence that you have. And in this particular instance, you will sabotage yourself 9 times out of 10 by suddenly stopping believing that God loves you. If you find yourself in a place where suddenly you start believing that God's not there for you and he's abandoned you and he doesn't love you, it's a snowball effect, and you'll find yourself dismissing him and doing weird things that he might be in no way, shape, or form okay with, in order to make life work for yourself in ways that you don't need to. And nobody ever hears that, because when they're in the midst of chaos and pain, all that they feel is the chaos and the pain. And that's the best time to sabotage yourself. That's the best time to say, I'm going to take control of this and do it my own way. Which is great, because most times with people who are in those states of chaos and pain, they got there because they couldn't control things. So now they're going to control it. It's going to be different, right? That's what we always think. Or we're going to do it the same way as we've been doing it for a decade, and it's going to be different somehow than it has been every other time when it's blown up in our faces. These are patterns that we do, that we commit to. And by committing to them and clinging to them, we just keep sabotaging ourselves again and again and again and again and again. Because we're not willing or open to see something new. We're only willing and open to see what we have seen before, or what's comfortable, then we stay there. Or what we decide is right based off of the minimal amount of evidence that we have in our lives. We're going to construct a reality based off of that. And then when things come up that challenge that, we're going to dismiss them so that we can stay there, which is also self-sabotaging again. So that's the first thing to look at in terms of sabotage, is ourselves. You know, it's one of those things where we'll color our understanding of reality so much based off of our experiences, based off of so many different things, based off of our self-value. I mean, we see it all the time. There are people who will take it upon themselves because they have a rejection issue. Suddenly, they have this person who's here and they love this person, but suddenly they get it in their head that maybe this person's going to reject them because they've been rejected so many times, and that's the normal thing. Everyone has to reject you eventually, right? Because that's what your experience is. So what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to start rejecting them first to protect myself. It's a great idea. It really is. Because it ensures that you will continue to have that pattern be recited again and again and again in your lifestyle, in your life. And the best part is if you push them away, you force them to make the decision to reject you. And then when the onus is on them to make the decision and they do it, then you can blame them, as opposed to being aware of your own decision to do so, to put this forward. And the thing of it is a lot of us aren't even aware. Like, a lot of the time it's even subconscious. It's what happens when we're not paying attention to our own actions. It's one of those things, like, introspection is obscenely important. Obviously, too much of it can be bad, but none of it, or too little of it, can be even worse. So, and the rejection thing is just one example of many, many, many things where we self-sabotage with relationships, with jobs, with careers, with friendships. There are so many things that we try to take control in many different ways, and whether we realize it or not, we're just manifesting the same destiny over and over and over again for ourselves. See, a lot of the fun part about, like, prophecy, for example, in the church, the most fun prophecies are the ones that you don't control. It's when God tells you something that's going to happen and then it happens without you trying. If you have to make it happen, that's not really a prophecy, is it? If you have to take it upon yourself to force the issue, that's just effectively a course of action. And then you get the results that maybe you wanted or you hoped for. That doesn't really bring any, like, glory to God, in a sense, when you have to take control of the entire thing and make it something that you do. And I'm not talking about small things where, like, you know, you have to head out to this place so God's will can be done. I'm talking about when you have to, like, take control of every facet of it. I'm going to force this into existence. And what's worse is in my experience, when I've seen people, like, try to force a prophecy forward, they usually end up sinning in the process. I've seen people lie in order to make God's will happen. I've seen people fight other people. I mean, like, physically fight them to make God's will happen. And there's just a lot of stuff where it's like, why did you think that was okay? Well, because God gave me this word. Okay, do you think that was your job to carry that forward? Well, that's how they work. No, that's not how that works. When God tells you something he's going to do, that means he's going to do it. So there are a lot of ways that we can self-sabotage. And a lot of them involve us taking control of things for ourselves, or in a lot of the times that comes out of a place of desperation, hopelessness, doubt, anxiety, because we need it to happen our way. And we'll end up tripping over our own feet in the process. The other big thing to talk about, it comes from another story. It's another one you don't hear a lot. I reference it a lot at different times because it's I don't know, it's just something that God's given me a few different times. But it's out of 1 Kings 13. Starting in verse 1. Well, I'll facilitate this a little bit, summarize it, because it's
First King or second?
1 Kings 13, the prophecy against Jeroboam's false altar. So, effectively what happens is there's a guy who's only ever referred to as the man of God, who gets sent down, who comes to Judah from Bethel. And he finds...
Bible study, huh?
How'd you know? I'm kidding.
He only ever referred to as the man of God. He shows up to King Jeroboam at the temple in Judah and finds him stretched out over this altar. And he gives him this word. He cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord. O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born of the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who now make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. That same day the man of God gave a sign. This is the sign the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out. When King Jeroboam heard the man of God and what he said, he cried out for his guards to effectively go get him. Immediately his hand shriveled up and was paralyzed. And the funny part about it is that he then looks to this man of God and asks him to come over and pray for his hand to be healed. So he does. Like, the man of God comes over and prays for Jeroboam's hand to be healed. And it is. In the process of that, if I remember, yeah. In the process, when he reaches out and the hand gets shriveled, that's when the altar splits open and the ashes pour out as well. Anyway, as after praying for the hand to be healed, the man of God, or Jeroboam asks the man of God, will you come back to my house and eat with me? And the man of God, or come back and eat with me and I'll give you a gift. And the man of God says no. Because he has very clear instructions from God, which are to not eat or drink anything there and to not come back by the way he came. So it's weird, but it happens. So he refuses the king, which is kind of a big deal at this point in time. Refusing the favor of a king can be seen as an insult. But he was let go. And he proceeds forward, going out on his way. And there's a man inside the city who hears about this whole event, this other prophet. And he's only ever referred to as a prophet. He asks his sons who this guy was, what happened, and he goes out and finds him. When the prophet finds the man of God, He finds him sitting under an oak tree and asks, "Are you the man of God who came from Judah?" "I am," he replied. So the prophet said to him, "Come home with me and eat." The man of God said, "I cannot turn back and go with you, nor can I eat bread or drink water with you in this place. I have been told by the word of the Lord that you must not eat bread or drink water there or return by the way you came." The old prophet answered, "I too am a prophet, as you are. And an angel said to me by the word of the Lord, 'Bring him back with you to your house, so he may eat bread and drink water.'" So the man of God returned with him and ate and drank in his house. The trouble is, the old prophet, was lying when he gave that word. So while they were eating, the old prophet gets a word from God saying, basically, you screwed up. And as a result, you're not going to go home. You're not going to be buried with your family. So the man of God gets up and leaves afterwards, saddles his donkey, he heads back, he gets killed by a lion on the road. The lion doesn't eat him, just sits next to the body. The donkey also sits next to the body until the old prophet shows back up to collect, and then he buries them. This is the other side. One of the other major things with sabotage is other people. See, we're great at sabotaging ourselves, but we're also great at having other people jump in and do it for us in some way or another. In the case of this old prophet, he was so enamored by wanting to meet this man that he was willing to lie in order to get him to come back and eat with him and drink with him. Like, maybe his intentions were not completely evil, but at the same time, he was willing to have this guy, he was willing to lie to get this guy to break what God had told him to do and fool him into coming back. And as a result, the man of God died for it. Ultimately, what you find is that this is really unfair. And what you'll find over and over again is that when you have other people sabotage you in life, it's unfair. It's not fair that you can't have the job that you want to have because this one person showed up and lied on their application and lied in their interview in order to try to disqualify you. And then the employer believed it. It's not fair that your friends are turning on you because one friend decided that they were mad at you and proceeded to go out and spread a bunch of lies about you. And then all those other friends believed it. None of this is fair. It's not fair that you went to your fiance's parents' place and the parents decided they didn't like you and then they proceeded to tear you down to your fiance and trash on you, and then you proceeded to go back with your fiance and now suddenly they won't talk to you, they won't engage with you, they believe all these things that their parents said, and suddenly they're siding against you. None of it's fair. See, the problem is that when we're in control of things, and I run into this a lot personally because I've had a lot of instances where I've been stymied in my progression in life because other people have made decisions. Whether it was at this one church that I worked at when I was working on the prayer team at, and they decided to boot me off, for some silly stipulation. Or, or this one church that I showed up at because I was supposed to work there, but it all hinged on whether or not the pastor would accept me. Or when I went to Bibles college and, you know, the dean believed that I was supposed to be there but ultimately what happened was we instead find ourselves in a place of, it came down to a council meeting's decision, and they ultimately decided that no, actually, we're not going to do this, because the council was more interested in financials. This is the kind of stuff that we struggle with on a routine basis. And I myself struggle with this often, feeling kind of stuck as a result. And it's never fair. It's one thing if I'm the one doing it, if I make a mistake, if I make a decision that's poor, you know, I can take that and that responsibility, but it's a lot harder when it's somebody else, because I didn't even have a chance. It wasn't in my control to make this decision, or to make this happen, or to have life go this way. It was purely in the control of somebody else. And when it's in the control of somebody else, you'll find yourself in situations where they're going to drop the ball, and you're going to end up unseen. You're going to end up hurt. You're going to end up like pushed aside. And that's part of life, unfortunately, on this earth, in our societies. It doesn't matter what society you're a part of. There are always going to be people who don't see you, who don't appreciate you, or who just aren't listening, or too caught up in their own heads. You might have people who are self-sabotaging themselves, and you end up being the victim of their own self-sabotage. And your whole course forward gets sabotaged because they're making mistakes and doing silly things. That happens. And the irony of it is, like, you know, for me, I've had many times where I've been very angry at God about this kind of thing, where it's just like, you could have done this, you could have prevented this, you could have controlled this. But the funny thing about it is that, number one, you know, talking about free will just a few weeks ago, it wasn't entirely in God's control. They still got to make a decision. And that was the situation. They got to choose what they were going to do with themselves and their own activities. And yeah, they chose to do bad things, or they chose to not care, or to not be involved, or they chose to do whatever. That's fine, that happens. And that ends up being a circumstance that we face a lot. I mean, we can even be the person in this question where somebody else is getting sabotaged as a result of us doing things. But that's not quite our thing to address here. So we find ourselves in a place of just looking at this thing that with other people, the difficulty of being sabotaged by them is then what do we do with this? Well, like, it's really easy to blame God, but at the same time, that's kind of missing the point, because instead what we're doing is we're then projecting things onto God that are actually the fault of other people. So, to give an example, if I do something that sabotages Grant's forward motion in life.
Excuse you.
Right. Now I'm caught up in my own head. I'm not really paying attention. I'm not caring about Grant at this point. I'm just really frustrated about things that are going on with myself. And then as a result, I step on Grant's toes and he ends up tripping and falling, so to speak. Grant can do a lot of things with that. One, he can be really mad at me, and that's fair. That's my fault. I did it. He could also be really mad at God. I mean, God could have, stopped this from happening, right? He could have controlled it in some way. He could have never put me in the situation where I was allowed to step on his toes. And, there's a debate to be had there.
Yes, that's the wood pile, that's your pile that you're trying to.
But at the same time, like, in reality, I'm the one making the decisions in this particular instance. And when we talk about free will, we have to acknowledge that when God gave free will to people, he gave free will. That also comes with the onus of responsibility being on our own shoulders. So I'm at fault. It's me. And the thing of it is oftentimes, God will put people in our lives who are meant to be part of our lives in so many different ways. And it's easy sometimes to forget that there's really good stuff. Because Grant and I, up until that point, we could have had like a really great like working relationship and friendship, and then suddenly this one moment when I get caught up in myself and he gets hurt, suddenly it's like, it's bad enough to where it's like, God, why would you ever send this person into my life? That's horrible. In retrospect, after years of being able to heal, he might remember that there were really good times. But until that point in time, instead, we're going to be stuck in that one train of this terrible person, did all these bad things, blah, 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 blah.
You gotta have another pile, 3 piles, 4 piles.
And that's not to say that like we don't have people that come into our lives who are just plain and simply bad all the time. It's simply to say that sometimes relationships change. They might start off really good, and then suddenly somebody screws up, or they get lost, or they lose themselves, and then they end up screwing up the whole thing. And that's not to say that like how bad they might have become, because some people get really, really bad. And at that point, it's not to say, forget about the bad times and just remember the good times. But it is to say that, God didn't ordain them and put them in your life just so that he could have both of these things. At some point, they were given choices in how they were going to move forward and how they were going to act. And at some point, they chose to veer very much away from what God had intended. And that's not God screwing up, that's these people making decisions. Because again, with free will, we make our choices. And we continue to make our choices. And again, pointing back, there's a reason why I start off with the self-sabotage part. Because oftentimes where they do that is when they start doing their own thing. They start falling into their own patterns of self-sabotage. They start falling into their own patterns and caving to their fears, anxieties, doubts, and so many other things. Or maybe ambition is another one. I think that I personally have had to deal with more people choosing ambition over righteousness than most other things.
Preach.
So with their ambitions, they wanted things to be their way or this way, or they wanted to meet some goal or have a certain image of their church. And as a result, people got hurt and shoved to the side. All because that person desperately wanted to look a certain way or to have things look a certain way. It didn't matter that it was all superficial. What mattered was that it had the effect that they wanted. And that's what was important. To them anyways. To the wreckage and the people caught up in that, that's not what was important. What's important was the effect that they had on them and the fact that now they're suffering and in pain. And that's the thing. To go back and say, what do we do with that? There's a thing where we have to acknowledge the responsibility and where it belongs. When somebody hurts you, it's important to recognize who's responsible. And this works for two reasons. One, because we can oftentimes project onto, as Christians, we'll project onto God. He's like the third party that psychologists don't talk about because he's not part of their milieu. But the other thing is that we can also project onto ourselves. If your boyfriend or girlfriend turns into a complete jerk of a person, to be polite in a way, if they turn into the worst person in the world and they've made those decisions, that's on them. But oftentimes they won't take responsibility for that. So you're left with this thing, and I think the term is transference that we do. But basically what happens is it's just like, okay, there's responsibility here for this for all of this terrible that's happened. What do I do with this? They don't take responsibility. In fact, they're blaming it on me. Maybe it is me. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I needed to be stronger. Maybe I needed to be more open. Maybe I didn't listen to God properly. Maybe I pushed them into this because I was too much, or I wasn't enough, or maybe I was irresponsible with their heart.
Didn't play anything that time.
And as a result of that line of thinking, we might start finding little things, small things that we can grab onto and magnify in order to make it our fault. Because again, like I was saying just a little bit ago, and I know this for myself, if the responsibility is mine, it's easier to deal with than when the responsibility is somebody else's. Because if it's theirs, I've already run into an instance where them being in control of their own lives actually hurt mine. And that was already hard enough. Now, if I can't control the responsibility factor, then it's on them to apologize. But if they won't apologize and they won't acknowledge it, that they did something wrong, well, now what do? I mean, there's no justice in that. And sometimes we just have to accept that there's no justice, period. Somebody did something really, really wrong, and that's not fair. But it's not your fault either. Even if there were little things that you might have done to help push them along, at the end of the day, they still chose to respond the way they did. When you got mad, or when you were caught up in your own thing, and they responded and you said something mildly snippy, and their response was to explode on you, and then continue to explode on you for like 3 weeks straight, that was their decision. They did that. You're not actually responsible for how they reacted. So it's important to remember these things and stand on the ground that, okay, this is where the responsibility goes, and it needs to stay there. Yeah, you could have handled yourself a little bit better in that moment, but you also didn't deserve three odd days or whatever of misery as a result. You didn't deserve all the extra stuff that might have come with that. That wasn't warranted, that wasn't deserved, that wasn't just in any way, shape, or form. What they did was wrong. So we need to have responsibility settle where it belongs, and need to acknowledge where people have their own free will. And yeah, they need to apologize. Even though they might blame you and say it's your fault and so on, it's still their fault. It doesn't change it. That's important to remember that. And also not to take that responsibility from them and transfer it to the first person that reminds you of them in any way, shape, or form. Because projection is just as bad. At that point, you're blaming other people for things and maybe even punishing them for things that they didn't do. That's also severely wrong. And that's on you at that point. But it's important for us to resolve this. Many times I've had to accept that something that isn't fair has happened, and I've been hurt by it. And the responsibility's on that person. They did it. And they refuse to acknowledge that they were wrong. And that's also not fair. Even in trying to meet up and talk, and trying to, find common grounds and try to meet a resolution. When you've done everything that you can do, you've done everything that you can do. And at that point, you just kind of have to accept sometimes that, they're not going to change. And that means that person isn't coming back to your dinner parties. And maybe that's like a family member. So it doesn't change how you respond. You're not actually obligated to have people who are damaging to you in your life.
We both have sevens, same as we have for two.
You don't have to. It feels like it to some of us, but that's not true. And when it comes down to the discussion about like forgiveness, for example, when we talk about forgiveness, because that's a big deal for us as Christians, there is a point of being able to forgive somebody, but that doesn't mean that you have to absolve them of their sins and also accept them back into your life. If somebody has continued on a certain path that's destructive, it's one thing to forgive them for what they've done and to let that go.
Yes, absolutely.
But if they're continuing in those same patterns, that doesn't mean you have to now, okay, I've forgiven them. Now forgiveness means that I have to bring them back into my life and accept them for who they are. No, they're still the same person. You can see that somebody's broken and damaged and all these different facets of who they are, and also acknowledge that they've hurt you a lot, and it's not maybe your place to help them. Because that presumes that, number one, that God can't send other people, and number two, that, it all revolves around you to make your world better. And none of that's true. Sometimes you need to cut those people off. I mean, there's scripture for that we could go over. But that's where we settle with sabotage. It's not, when other people sabotage you, it's not fair, but it happens. And at that point, basically what you're left with is the wreckage. There are the feelings to feel through, the emotional damage. That's its own thing, and it takes time. And then you have the people themselves and what to do with those people. And those are decisions that you get to make. But it's important to be wise about it, and especially in terms of what's going to actually be good for you as a person. Because taking some hardline stance isn't actually good either when it comes down to, okay, I see a type of person, so I'm going to remove that type of person from my life. That goes back to rejection. But removing that person, it's fine. Sometimes it's necessary and very, very important. And that's okay. A lot of us tend to feel like it's our job to save the world. And that's not really true. We're part of that salvation. We're part of that thing. When Jesus talks about being salt and light, every Christian's part of that. They're not all of it. Okay? We have to remember sometimes that there are lots of other Christians out there, lots of other people who are following Jesus, who can also be part of this whole worldwide thing. But sometimes we get really caught, we get like tunnel vision and think it's all on us. The last passage is out of John 5. And it starts in verse 1, but for the sake of time, I'll kind of move through it a little bit. But it's essentially a story of Jesus going down to this one particular pool called Bethesda. And people used to sit around there, and they'd go into the pool whenever the waters would move, and sometimes they would receive healing. There was one man who'd been laying there for so many years, and when Jesus came down there and found out how long this man had been laying on his mat, he healed him. Like, the long and short of it is that he told him, pick up your mat and walk. And the man did it. He picked up his mat and he walked. The reaction to that, though, because this took place on a Sabbath day. And when the Jewish priests saw this man carrying his mat away after he was healed, they stopped him and were just like, what are you doing? This is Sabbath day. You can't carry a mat.
Who do you think you are?
So he explains to them, he's just like, this man healed me and told me to pick up my mat and walk. I don't know, man. And that's the thing is, in essence, this guy got criticized for doing something so in the midst of a miracle because of some institution. And this is one example of many, where like you see the stories throughout the Gospels where Jesus bucks heads with the Pharisees again and again and again, because they had so many rules revolving around so many frivolous aspects of life. Basically, it was what happens when religion is given way too much time to progress forward and take control, and especially to allow people into those places of like anxious thought that say, okay, Sabbath day means that we're supposed to rest, right? Well, what constitutes resting? Well, that means like we don't do anything, right? We just focus purely on relaxing. So what should we not do in order to rest? Well, obviously it means we should do no work. Well, what constitutes work? Anything strenuous. Oh, okay. So if it's anything strenuous, then can't that include things like carrying a mat after you've been healed from so many years of being unable to move? Or maybe it means that before we eat our food, we should go through a ceremonial cleansing rite as we clean our pots and pans to make sure that the food is righteously pure. There's a lot of weird stuff that Jesus bucks his head up against the Pharisees about. There's even one point where he talks about tithes, where the Pharisees were gloating about the way that they would tithe not only the first crops of their vegetables, but they would go as far as to tithe their spices. And they thought that was like a really big deal. And he was like, that's not a big deal. That's silly, guys.
No one cares.
Exactly.
Because to them, it wasn't about the quality, it was about quantity. They were like, oh, we're giving so much away. They
Right.
still had so much more left.
Yeah. And, there's so much to that. But it was this thing where, like, their religiousness had been taken to such extremes that they missed the point of everything that God was about. They lost sight of God's character and his person and their person in relation to him. So everything became about a strict following of rules, and if you did not follow those rules, then you were unrighteous and you were deemed unworthy to be close to God in any way, shape, or form. To the point where Jesus shows up, and you've got God in human form walking around talking to people, and they're telling him that he's unrighteous. It happened. But the point is, why we look at that during a message about sabotage is something called institutional sabotage or systematic sabotage. See, we'll use them as an example, but the reality is that it goes so much further. We talked about this a little bit, I think it was a couple weeks ago, maybe. But we talked about, right, it was a couple weeks ago. But we talked about the way that, like, sometimes society can become such a problem. And it can make you believe things. And we talked a lot about, like the way that America is very transactional. Even in relationships, even in friendships, even just societally, we're a very transactional culture. If I do something good for Aaron, I anticipate that he will do something good for me. If I'm nice to Aaron, he's obligated to be nice back. If I smile walking down the street at Aaron, he's obligated by society that he smile back. Even though he doesn't feel like it, and even though it looks something like it's still required that you smile back. That's how far it goes.
It's the law.
It's an unspoken, unwritten law.
Yeah.
And that's just to illustrate how far that permeates. To where just walking down the street, there's a transaction to be expected. And that's not to even speak of so many more. The point is, though, is that, like, when it comes down to it, oftentimes our society will actually rob us of so many things and effectively screw us over in the progression of our own lives and our own development. And the Pharisees are a fantastic example of this, because what they were doing, and Jesus actually expressly says something to this effect about how they would bind everybody with the same burdens as them and then make them doubly responsible. And this thing that they would do is that they had taken religion, they had taken everything to such an extreme that it wasn't even anything relating to God anymore. God was attached to some stuff, like they tried to honor him through it, but he had no actual hand in this. And as a result of that, because they had taken it to such an extreme, it was unapproachable. People couldn't even touch it. You had to be so perfect in order to be close to God. And that wasn't God's heart at all. Because as a result, they had actually lost sight, and everybody that looked to them and believed them, because they were the priests of the time, they were the people that everybody looked to and were trusting to be the guys who could teach you how to follow God. And as a result, they were actually leading people down these paths that sabotaged them from ever being close to God. And this is true nowadays too. Like, we still run into this in the church all the time. There are plenty of churches who preach this kind of gospel of death and damnation. In John 5, actually, if we read further, Jesus talks about how, the Father isn't going to judge, or does not judge, but instead he's given all judgment over to the Son. And how, so that the Lord may be glorified. So Jesus was carrying the decision, and his decision was to die for us, to show mercy. It's one of those things where there is a very, very different mentality here that Jesus illustrates versus what a lot of us are taught. And a lot of us have these very, we call them old school beliefs, but they're not really old school, they're just perverted. That we're supposed to do so much and be so good, and if we're not following these rules, you got the Seventh-day Adventist Church who still believes in the food laws, that your holiness is directly related to what you eat. And it's wavered since, but at the beginning, that's what it came under. You've got so many others where your righteousness comes down to what you do. And again, that goes back to the self-sabotage thing of talking about earning your salvation, earning love, earning favor with God. And people work and do all kinds of crazy things. And
These people have never read Ephesians 2:8-9.
Well, of course not. And the thing is that it just sets up people up. Even to the point that there's a passage in Matthew that's infamous for a lot of people, because a lot of people will hold it over their own heads for purposes of being afraid, which is when Jesus talks about how there will be some who come to him saying, Lord, I did all these things in your name. And he'll just be like, I never knew you. Get out of my sight. And the purpose of him explaining that wasn't to say, you should all be afraid, because you never know if you're going to be close enough to me. The point was to say, there are a lot of you who are doing things in my name who don't actually know me, and I don't know you, and I don't know who you're talking to, but you're doing a lot of things and saying it's on me, and you have no place in heaven. And that's a thing that we run into, and there are a lot of people who have been raised up in those kinds of beliefs who have no idea. You know, when I was talking to Heather and Dusty about the message and about stuff that God was showing me about it, one of the examples that I gave, because, you know, I set the stage with the first story, so I suppose we'll just keep it at a dark level, was, you know, there were people who believed that, you know, back in, like, at different points in time, you know, they had their pastor get up and talk about, like, homosexuality and, you know, how evil gays were. So when these teenagers went out and, like, beat up the gay kid, they thought they were doing something righteous. And then they'll find themselves standing before God, and they might very well hear those words from Jesus, and they're going to wonder why. But I did what I was supposed to be doing right. The pastor told me that that was righteous. I beat up an enemy of God. All the while, you know, for Christ himself, his story repeatedly throughout the Gospels is that pointing to the only enemy of God is Satan. That's the only one. And that's it. Nobody else. Everyone else is your brother, your sister, your whatever. They're all family. And it's on us to help them, to be there for them. So as a result, we have people who have done really bad things because a system was put in place that led them to do things that were completely opposed to God's will. But because somebody stood up at a pulpit and said God wills it, they did it. Like, I know I've heard over the years, you know, in debates with atheists and various other people, I'll have the Crusades shoved in my face, and it's just like, okay, so the reality of the Crusades was what? The Pope got up and made a decision. The Pope didn't speak for God. He spoke for his own political agenda. And then he put up a bunch of lies in order to perpetuate forward and see his agenda preserved. That happens. That's when an institution sabotages people, because there were a lot of knights, a lot of people who went out to the Holy Land believing that their sins were going to be completely expunged because they killed a bunch of Arabs. They were ignorant, some of them. But that's where it was. They had been told this by others and they believed it. And that person will probably end up seeing a lot more punishment than any one of those people, but it still stands. Like, they set up a system, they set up an institution. So, and the thing of it is we end talking about institutional sabotage because, and start with self-sabotage, because at the end of the day, the first place we need to be looking is ourselves with this kind of thing. Am I sabotaging myself? Am I doing things? And the reality is that it's in that introspection that oftentimes we end up even realizing the other things. You know, when somebody else sabotages you, it's fine. Like, it's so much, it's easy to see that. Okay? Usually. Like, unless you really muddy the waters for yourself or go blindly forward. Or if you just have, like, a very, very low level of self-esteem where you have a tendency to blame yourself for things, then yeah, you might easily fall prey to that. But a lot of the institutional stuff, you realize that when you start to look at yourself and where you're at, as opposed to, you know, what God presents forward, or even what looks like being a good person. And you find yourself doing things that no good person would do. Like, if you see yourself doing things where Jesus would be like, what are you doing? That's usually bad. Like, not to quote bring back the old what would Jesus do thing, but I mean, it was a fair little reminder in some ways. Granted, if you don't know Jesus, then it's going to make it hard to like make a decision on that. But if you do, it's actually pretty easy, and it's not a bad guide. But the bigger thing is just to be aware. In reference to the Crusades, one of my favorite movies was called Kingdom of Heaven. And there's a scene where the main character goes in and sees the King of Jerusalem. And the King of Jerusalem sitting there with a chessboard. And he's kind of like talking to the guy as he walks in. And he explains how, a king may move a man, a father may claim a son, but at the end, your soul is in your own hands. And you can't, when you stand before God, you can't tell him, oh, I was told by others to do this. It will not suffice. Because at the end of the day, like, even though there are institutions that will set you up to fall, you have to hold on to them in order to let them keep you down. And that means when you're faced with realities of Jesus' character or God's will or different things like that, and you choose to default to your society or to religion or different things like that, that's a choice you make, and that's on you. When you're being met by the Holy Spirit and you tell him no so that you can continue working really hard to earn God's love, as opposed to feeling it in the moment when it shows up, that's on you. And to bring it to a more physical level, when you're provided the opportunity to love somebody who really needs to be loved, but you choose instead to push them away because you're really mad at this other person who offended you, and this person kind of reminds you of that person, and then you abandon them, and then they just suffer, that is also on you. And that's where you sabotage yourself from not experiencing something incredible, and you sabotage them by robbing them of the opportunity to have somebody help them. So, that's what I've got.
Woot.